This meeting is now streaming live on YouTube.
We're good. Okay. Well, I'm just going to try and find it on my YouTube channel.
This meeting is now streaming live on YouTube. Got a slight delay, it would seem.
Yeah, I can hear myself.
I heard myself too.
Find it on my YouTube channel. Okay, we've got one person watching as well, which is me. All right, I'll turn that off because it's quite distracting.
Yeah, will we?
And we'll just do it from here. And I think we're live streaming with zero zero people in the audience. All right, so hello everybody who's not there. But we'll be recording this, so hopefully more people will watch later. Welcome to the third dialogue of Free Kiwis. And this is really another experiment because we wanted to try and use the live stream because we haven't done that before. And we're sort of gearing up to do a live stream session, which is going to be our first book club session, which we've advertised before. It's going to be a bunch of us reading Jeremy Waldron, The Harm in Hate Speech. And we've got two other members of the Free Kiwis community who are going to be talking with us about that book, having read it together, having read different chapters of it. And we still haven't got a firm date for that, but that's going to be at the end of March. So look out for that. So for the time being, I mean, we really just wanted to do a live stream session, but there's obviously lots to talk about. And I mean, I guess we started Free Kiwis because we were kind of concerned about free speech in particular, but also sort of the idea of freedom in general, and whether it's being lost in society, in liberal democratic societies at the moment. Not so much liberty itself, I suppose, as the concept of it, and in particular the centrality of that concept. Something that was seen as an organizing principle and almost a sort of principle we took for granted, something that everybody just knew was part of our societies. Is that being lost? So yeah, as something, I guess I'll just put that to you, Michael. But I will say, even in saying this, I feel a bit of a cringe. I feel like, you know, as soon as you start talking about liberty or freedom nowadays, I'm thinking, oh, people are thinking I'm sort of one of these deplorables, and I'm going to be, you know, storming Parliament or something like that, right? So you automatically start to think, when you're talking about freedom, I'm going to be kind of painted with this particular brush.
Yes, it's interesting how it's become so tribalized in a political sense in that way, because of course, as you said, for at least the last century and you know, arguably the last 2 centuries or perhaps even slightly more, it's been central as a concept to the democracies as they emerged in England and then, you know, Australia and New Zealand, America, these countries that are now democratic. But of course, it wasn't always like that. And we have to wonder whether the idea of liberty is itself almost a self-limiting thing. I don't think we can talk coherently about attitudes towards freedom without getting a little bit psychoanalytic, because to embrace freedom is to embrace risk. It's to embrace the idea that there is no authority that can fix everything for one, that one's responsible to oneself for one's problems and difficulties and challenges. And of course, we can embrace both freedom and community and work together and have compassion for one another's difficulties and so on. But in the end, to embrace freedom fully is to embrace responsibility.
Yeah, that's right. I'm glad you brought up that angle, because I actually just had to look it up, but there is a book, isn't there, by Erich Fromm, Fear of Freedom.
Yes.
And
yes.
And I believe that was written, you know, in the aftermath of Nazi Germany. And
in fact, it was written, it's even more phenomenal than that. It was written by a German Jew during the Holocaust. It was written, right. I think it came out in 1942, I believe. I may be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure it came out during the war. And of course, he wasn't in Germany. He was in America, but he was trying to understand what had happened in Germany that had given rise to Nazism, that had given rise to the Holocaust. And he traced it back to Protestantism and capitalism in the early Renaissance, which, you know, he saw as no coincidence, had arisen in Germany, both of them, with Luther and with the Hanseatic League on the Baltic coast in the case of capitalism. And both of these things represented a new step in human freedom in a way, because in terms of Protestantism, for the first time, human beings were posited to be in a direct relationship with God, directly responsible to God for their actions, for their sins, whereas under Catholicism, that was mediated by a priesthood. So Protestantism shook up the religious order, obviously, and it shook up psychologically people's orientation to the notion of sin and redemption. Capitalism, which was almost contemporaneous with Protestantism, shook up the social order. So whereas under feudalism, everybody, including the king and everybody underneath him in the social order, had a fixed place with fixed responsibilities and a fixed destiny, essentially. If you were born the king, you would stay the king. If you were born a peasant, you would stay a peasant. Once capitalism got going, we started to have the phenomenon of people becoming wealthy, independent of their position in life, because they could trade their way to wealth. Now, obviously, that had always happened to some extent, but it started to be a real social phenomenon that resulted in a powerful commercial class that hadn't necessarily existed throughout the Middle Ages in quite the same way. So Fromm's basic thesis is that these two things, Protestantism and capitalism, gave people a lot more freedom, but they also led to fear, because in spiritual terms, now they feared God in a way that they hadn't before, because whereas in the past the priesthood could reassure them that they confessed their sins and they were saved, they now had to appeal directly to God. And probably that fear found its ultimate expression in Calvinism, which posits that we're actually predestined to be saved or not, that our name is in the book of life or it isn't in the book of life. And here is where Protestantism and capitalism come together, because the way you can tell whether you're saved or not is by how much God favors you in this life. So if you are wealthy, then that's a sign that God favors you. So this provides an incentive to work hard and to build up wealth so that you can convince yourself that you're saved. Hence the Protestant work ethic.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, so it goes back quite a way. I haven't read this book by Fromm, so it's interesting to get your synopsis. But it obviously reminds me also of a figure that we've brought up several times now on Free Kiwis, which is Karl Popper. Also, not a German Jew in this case, but an Austrian Jew. So in a very similar situation, obviously, has to flee the country. And he's also writing The Open Society and Its Enemies in the 1940s. And of course, the point of that is to ask the very same question: how could this have happened? You know, how could Nazism have actually sort of taken over not only any old country, but, you know, a country which up until that point had been seen as one of the freest and most civilized and most advanced countries in the world. And I guess Popper also does a sort of deep dive, as they say nowadays. In his case, it's a kind of high theory perspective. It's saying actually this form of thinking has come down to us from a kind of lineage of philosophers running through Plato and Aristotle and Hegel and Marx. Whereas Fromm has a more psychoanalytic perspective. So basically, the takeaway, if I'm reading you correctly, I mean, besides all to extract from the sort of historical story about Protestantism and capitalism, which is an interesting one, Fromm's theory kind of boils down to the idea that freedom ultimately is quite scary, right? I mean, and that's an interesting thought, because if you grew up, you know, in the last few decades in liberal democracies, you kind of come away with this assumption that everyone wants freedom, right? Everyone wants to live in a nice democratic place where you can sort of say more or less what you want and do more or less what you want and choose what's meaningful in life and what you want to pursue, etc. But Fromm is suggesting something that's the opposite of that. He's saying that actually we find freedom quite difficult in some instances.
He's saying that it can be an overwhelming psychological burden.
Yeah.
So overwhelming that that at sometimes in places, people, most notably in 1930s Germany, people have been prepared to embrace totalitarianism to avoid the responsibility that comes with freedom.
Yeah, and you sort of know what he means. I mean, I don't I don't know what he means in the sense of like, oh yeah, I want to embrace totalitarianism, not to that extent, but I mean, on the micro level, you have these little experiences. I mean, most of us do at least. That it's kind of like, I can't be bothered to think about, even like what restaurant to go to tonight. Can someone make that decision for me?
Someone make that decision for me. Or, the generic they should do something about X, which bothers me in society.
Yeah.
And I think that's a marker of somebody actually, if somebody says that kind of thing a lot, it's a marker that actually they don't like freedom that much.
Well, no, but I mean, the thing is, though, I mean, when I observe it in myself, though, I kind of think it's interesting that can exist on the sort of micro level. I mean, I'm pretty. Yes. I mean, this, as you know, I mean, we're doing this podcast together. I'm pretty big on the open society and freedom at the political level, but I do see it as it's a part of our psychological makeup, or at least mine. But yeah, from time to time, you think, actually, this is kind of burdensome to make decisions, and social scientists in recent years have done quite a lot of work on this, I believe. I think some of it is vulnerable to the kind of problems with replication that we've seen in psychology in recent years. But anyway, it's along the lines of people do find choices burdensome. And, you give people more choices, and the standard liberal democratic assumption is that's a good thing. Even standard capitalist assumption is that's a good thing. And actually people come away after they've been presented sort of with more choice, they actually come away less satisfied with their final decision. They find it harder to decide on what thing they're going with, whether it's choosing between different types of fruit or cereal, or it's choosing a life partner or a job. This effect, the choice paradox, seems to hold. So I mean, it's I think it's an experience we all have. In most cases, it doesn't seem to lead to the decision to join the Nazis or the Stalinists or the Maoists or whatever.
No, indeed, not yet. Anyway, in our societies, although things are arguably getting a bit Maoist out there at the moment. But another consideration here, or another connection we could make, is actually to the work of a previous guest on Free Kiwis, John Haidt, who in publishing with Greg Lukianoff, the Coddling of the American Mind, is pointing out a certain psychological vulnerability, especially in young people, which they argue comes from a lack of exposure to risk in childhood and social media. Now, if we go to the risk issue, perhaps what that means, if people are not exposed to risk, well, in that book, they argue that they then don't develop this kind of resilience that comes with anti-fragility. That's Nicholas Taleb's term to describe the phenomenon that actually human beings get stronger under a certain degree of pressure, not too much or that will break us, but the right amount of stress and pressure actually strengthens us psychologically, just as it strengthens us physically if we do hard exercise and so on. So if we have a generation that has not been sufficiently exposed to risk and challenge growing up, it might leave them in a psychologically weakened and perhaps immature state where they're not prepared to embrace full adulthood. And this is full adulthood in a psychoanalytic sense, which means taking responsibility for one's choices, accepting the consequences. I mean, this connects to Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of radical freedom as well. Radical, what did he call it? Is it radical freedom? I think that was I don't know what the French term is, but the idea that we can do absolutely anything we want as long as we're prepared to embrace the consequences. And that of course is a big condition, embracing the consequences of what we do.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that's at the heart of his existentialism, right? The idea that he said notoriously, in the Second World War, the French were freer than ever under Nazi occupation, precisely because their choices had so much weight, which is
Yes.
I think he was being playful when he said that, but he, you know, his theory of existentialism did have that as a kind of axiom that human life is all about making these decisions, which are incredibly burdensome because they do affect, you know, where your life goes in the future, and they affect you as a moral agent in other ways as well.
And not only that, they affect it in unpredictable ways. You can't possibly see all of the consequences of the actions you take. So, and the decisions and choices you make. So to embrace that is in a way to embrace a degree of chaos, right? Because if I say, I will own all of my choices, and that means embracing their consequences or dealing with their consequences, taking on board my responsibility for the consequences, even when those consequences were unforeseeable and unintended. That's a big call existentially. So it takes a great degree of psychological maturity to fully do that. In fact, you'd probably argue that very few human beings have ever managed to do it entirely.
Right.
But the
So
question is whether we can have enough people do it enough to maintain liberty as a value in a society. And what we might take from Fromm is that is very far from a given.
Yeah, right. But you can see how people get on this track, though, because in a sense, it's a track that we all want to be on, because we all have this tendency to some extent, to want to avoid choice. I mean, we also have opposite tendencies. We have countervailing tendencies to want to have more choices. But you can see why people chose this route, or you can see why people sometimes make decisions which will lead to their array of choices being narrowed, because, you know, it's less burdensome, there's less responsibility, you have to think less, it's more pleasant. Yeah, so I mean, that's the psychoanalytic angle. I guess there's two other ways I wanted to go with this, which I've completely forgotten now. So one was this idea that part of the reason I was cringing at the beginning when talking about liberty or freedom at all is because we're in this environment of a very high degree of negative affective polarization. In other words, we're in a place in the world at the moment where people hate each other more than they used to, and they hate their political enemies, people that they perceive as being in different political tribes. There's more negative feelings towards them than there used to be even 5 or 10 years ago. And that's also something that John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff do a good job of documenting in their book, yeah. The Coddling of the American Mind. And you can see it in surveys. It's very straightforward. You can ask people things like, you know, do you think the other side, do you think Republicans or Democrats are evil, and the numbers shoot up. And you can also see that people are polarizing in terms of their political views. The people are sorting into extremes in the center is hollowing out. So that's something right. I think
the ratings of opposite sides of politics have pulled apart over the last decade and a half. They've got, so Democrats rate Republicans as worse people than they did 10 years ago, and vice versa is also true.
Yeah, that's right. And so the reason I think this is relevant to the discussion about freedom is just that we can both remember a time that wasn't so long ago when freedom, well, let's start with freedom of speech. I mean, freedom of speech was something that I think everybody paid lip service to. Kind of like in the way in a Commonwealth country, both sides tend to have to pay lip service to the monarchy. You know, it was almost like one of those foundational institutions or ideas that everybody just had to say, oh, we're on the side of free speech. Otherwise, you'd be, I don't know, you'd be a communist or an authoritarian or something, right? But it was mainly the left that was, it was basically the left that was better at it. And I think that's also the same for freedom, more or less. I mean, I think that if I think back to sort of the 90s, when people who talked about freedom, they were often on the socially liberal left, because there's been a lot of gains on that front in recent years. So it's kind of easy to forget that, you know, even things like gay marriage were still controversial in the 90s and noughties. And at that time,
and even the idea that gay men ought to be able to have sex with one another was controversial in 1990. I mean, it was legal in most places by then, but not everywhere. I think Tasmania, the state of Australia, didn't legalize it until sometime in the 1990s. New Zealand legalized it in 1986 against some fairly fierce opposition. So I think you're right about that. And I think it's precisely because the left was fighting for those social freedoms, women's liberation, gay liberation, the civil rights movement, these kinds of things that were fighting for equal recognition of the humanity of people on the basis of sex, sexuality, and race.
Yeah,
and
so
it's
that was
ironic that those very things have now become touchstones of authoritarianism.
That's right. So that was the socially liberal left back then. I think they very much embraced freedom. And the other group that I think was around even then were libertarians, actually. And I think if I think back to when I was at school, university, the kind of libertarians, especially in the States, who would found liberty groups and things like that, I think that they were seen as kind of slightly boring just because it was taken so much for granted. Of course, everybody wants to respect the Constitution. Of course, everybody thinks there should be free speech, but now I look back at them and think those guys, those high school students in suits founding liberty clubs, they were kind of right. Maybe they could see.
Yeah, and of course they were also championing economic freedom, which the left was always less inclined to do.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the point. I mean, I think that it's interesting because if I think back to the libertarian movement then, it seemed like it was quite a niche thing. I mean, it still is in many ways. And it seemed to me like there were people who had what I perceive of as a reasonably strong view of economic liberty. And then they all were also sort of pushing this idea of liberty in general. But, that aspect of it seemed just sort of routine. It almost wasn't worth saying. And that I think is very much changed. And I think that the freedom of speech, the change in terms of the way that we as a society view freedom of speech has happened maybe over the last 3 or 4 years, maybe 5. And I think just now we're starting to see, I mean, I get this idea from Wesley Yang, who's written about wokeism and what he calls the successor ideology in many different places. And he has suggested that now freedom has become one of these terms, which is associated uniquely with one side, and it's the sort of wrong side at the moment, the side that doesn't have as much power in the current discourse. And I mean, I've written about this a bit on my Substack as well. I think that it has a lot to do with the period of George Bush and George Bush going into Iraq, and George Bush talking about promoting freedom by the sword. I think that the excesses to which his regime or his government went, his administration went, I think that sort of irredeemably tainted this idea of freedom, especially for the left. And now it's gotten to the point where they can't even remember that they used to be the freedom people.
Yeah, so I mean, it may well be that what you say is correct, but this may be a slightly different take on it. So see what you think. I think that for all the rhetoric about freedom that Bush put forward, his regime instituted various things that fundamentally undermined democracy, and I think those things have had long-lasting effects, because once you undermine a cornerstone of democracy, it doesn't just come back when whatever crisis engendered it is over, which is why Justin Trudeau, for example, is now responsible for a dreadful crime against democracy when he seized bank accounts and did these things to the truckers in order to break up their protest. But to go back to the Bush era, all of the time that Bush was going on about they hate our freedoms, we have to go in there and take out the dictators, Saddam Hussein in particular, he was implementing things in America that are fundamentally opposed to democratic ideals. He opened the Guantanamo Bay prison camp where people were incarcerated. Many innocent people, not only innocent people, but many innocent people were subjected to torture. They were subjected to arbitrary detention for years without recourse to lawyers, without recourse to the rule of law. Not only that, he set up surveillance on a massive scale in America. He passed the Patriot Act, which gave the American government enormous scope to seize assets, to intrude into people's lives. And so those things that took place against, objections largely from the left, but not only, from libertarians as well, like Ron Paul, for example, was strongly opposed. And he was a libertarian Republican to what Bush was doing. So I think we have to bear in mind that despite his rhetoric, Bush was and his regime was highly authoritarian. And I think that did I won't say it started the rot, because I think we can talk about some precursors that were less egregious in the 1990s. But I do think that that era is hugely responsible for some of the political issues that we're facing now, because he normalized that kind of thing. And Obama didn't stop doing it.
Yeah, no, I basically agree with you. I mean, I'm not sure if I would say highly authoritarian, just because highly authoritarian for me is like Saddam or Mobutu, rather than even
Sure, sure. Highly authoritarian relative to the way democracies have been, put it that way.
No, I agree with that, and I do agree also that, you know, there were egregious excesses in reaction to Islamist terrorism, and that must be one of the mechanisms of what's happening here, because they set up certain systems and certain ways of doing things, which I think have now been copied by the other side, as it were. And you can even see some of the same thought processes and some of the same arguments about, you know, a threat. Often these threats, I mean, with white supremacism and Islamist terrorism, I mean, they're in some ways quite symmetrical, in the sense that in both cases you have something which is very clearly pretty evil, especially in its sort of most undiluted extreme form, you know, either in 9/11 or in the Christchurch shooting. But it can be also exaggerated in the sense of how widespread it is and how much of a threat it is to the social order as a whole. And, you know, you get this same. It's hard to call an overreaction, because, as I say, these things in their purest form are very sheer evil, right?
Yes.
But you know, you get these clamping downs on and erosions of civil liberties, which maybe aren't justified by the real extent of the phenomenon.
Well, I think that is the moot question. So to me, it's not so much an overreaction, because, as you say, I mean, 9/11 was an incredibly violent and vicious act. I mean, we could compare it to certain actions that the West has taken in other countries as well, and see whether it's really as, you know, so much worse than, say, the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the Vietnam War, which slaughtered far more innocent people than 9/11 did. So when people consider themselves to be at war, as the perpetrators of 9/11 did, they do dreadful things. That's no justification, of course, but we do have to put it in the context of things that the West has done in other countries as well, I believe. I don't think it's a straightforward. It's straightforward that it was so much worse. Having said all of that, it was a terrible thing, and it called for a strong reaction. However, is that it's not so much an overreaction as the wrong reaction to start to shut down the very institutions that you claim to be defending in the name of defending them.
Yeah, that's right. But it's interesting. I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about foreign policy, because today is the day, after all, that, or the day in the Northern Hemisphere anyway, that Russia has now sent troops into Ukraine. I mean, there's been fighting in the breakaway republics, the Donbass region, for a while, but it seems like the sort of main big Russian invasion that everyone's been anticipating for weeks has now started. And it's an interesting time, I think, partly because it looks like the West is not going to fight. They're not going to send in troops. And I'm not wanting to start a conversation about whether that's a good idea or not. I mean, I think I would probably favor something a little bit more robust, and I can see why you wouldn't want to, because we might start World War III, for example, which would not be good. But it's just interesting to me that, again, the discourse around this, and my sense again is that there have been less calls for a kind of robust defense of Ukraine and its liberal democratic institutions, imperfect as they may be, because in the current state of the discourse, you'd have to make arguments which appeal to things like freedom and democracy. And in the post-George W. Bush world, those things make you sound silly. They make people cringe, because it's uncool. Because basically the side that were against Bush, which is with a certain amount of justification, won that part of the culture war. And I say it is a certain amount of justification, because I'm also thinking about abuses in prisons and so on and so forth. But there is something called throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I happen to think that freedom and democracy are actually quite good things. So that it is legitimate to make arguments saying, well, let's try and defend freedom and democracy. And then we can talk about whether it's actually a practicable and wise thing to do in various military situations.
That's right. That's right. And you're probably quite correct. I mean, it would be interesting to know what would have happened if something like this had taken place 25 years ago, say in the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the Soviet Union broke up. If instead of Boris Yeltsin, there had been an immediate Putin-like figure who had decided to just take back Ukraine, and what NATO would have done then. It's hard to know, isn't it? Because it's not immediately obvious that it's a strategically good idea to take on the Russian army in what is indubitably its sphere of influence.
Yeah, and it's a tricky case as well because, I think Ukraine has something like 15 to 20% ethnic Russians. So, and I've met people. I mean, I used to have a friend at school who was from Ukraine, and he identified as Russian. And he was saying even in the late 90s, I think Ukraine should still be part of Russia. So there is that constituency. I mean, I guess it would be a different conversation if we were talking about Finland or Estonia, even though the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union. But yes. My hunch, and that sort of counterfactual that you just raised, my hunch is that at the end of the Cold War, there would have been a bit more robustness about pushing liberty in Eastern Europe. And in fact, there was. I mean, this is argument some people are making at the moment, is that the West, and America in particular, was too aggressive against Russia. And people are saying, oh, you can sort of understand what Putin's doing because, he feels threatened. We should never have expanded NATO East. There was basically a tacit agreement not to do that.
Well, I may agree with that. I don't know enough about foreign policy to venture a strong opinion, but I do understand that there was an undertaking between Gorbachev and Reagan when Gorbachev was trying to negotiate a peaceful end to communism in the Soviet Union, that NATO would not expand east. And of course, it did fairly quickly expand east in terms of encompassing countries like Poland, who had been part of the Eastern Bloc. That's one thing. It's another thing to start to encroach on ex-Soviet states. And I think that is a strategically stupid thing to have done, without knowing enough about it. And I'm willing to stand corrected by people who know more. But it seems to me that it's adding insult to injury or injury to insult in many ways when, Russia is a very ancient civilization with a lot of pride, and it's suffered a geopolitical humiliation with the fall of its little empire. Yeah. And to rub salt into that wound by starting to incorporate its ex-territories into an alliance that is at least tacitly hostile to it doesn't seem a very good plan.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm sort of open to that kind of objection. I mean, I also think that, I also agree with Garry Kasparov that, one way of looking at this is also that Putin was a crazy dictator, and we could see that 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Sure.
We never cozied up to him to the extent that we did with gas pipelines and, inviting him to international events. And that was always going to end badly. And to a certain extent, we've appeased him, and he's been able to invade Georgia and invade the Crimea. And of course, all the feedback, this is what you call basic psychology, right? All the feedback is that he can keep going. But anyway, again, I think what interests me most here is this sort of change in the discourse, because I think that at the end of the Cold War, with the Baltic states, which were part of the Soviet Union, when they became freed, I mean, we really did talk about liberalization of them. And I'm sure you could go back and find articles in the Atlantic and even the New York Times talking about how these states were now free. And all that kind of discourse now sounds like what academic types call a narrative. And it just sort of starts to make you cringe, because you're not meant to say, oh, isn't it wonderful they have liberty now? but I maybe I'm sort of unreconstructed in the sense. I kind of think, oh, liberty is actually a good thing.
I must be even more.
And then you could talk about maybe the tax rates in Estonia were too low or flat or whatever. But just the basic idea that freedom is a good thing, I think, is something that is worth taking, is worth still having around.
I must be even more unreconstructed than you, because I don't even cringe. I still wholeheartedly embrace the notion of liberty and freedom, because from a psychological perspective, it's the only set of values that allows us to fully explore who we are. And I don't want to live in a society where I can't do that, where thought is trammeled by ideology. That to me is a kind of hell that I don't want to be part of. So I'm very unashamed in my defense of liberty and freedom. But I do think you're right in terms of this issue with Ukraine, that actually it's the rhetoric, the political stance that's being taken, more than whether or not there's a military response, because that is a question for military strategists. Is it, you don't go into a war that you don't think you can possibly win. That's crazy. So, but what is being said about it by Western European and American government is another question. And I think you're right that would have been very different 25 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess I'm obviously the defender of freedom and free speech as well. I mean, that's why we're doing this podcast together. I guess I'm slightly more affected by what I can feel in the air in terms of the cultural shift which we've experienced.
I feel it absolutely. I just think we have to resist it with every fiber of our being, and do so unapologetically.
No, I would agree with that too. Yeah. So the other strand I just remembered, the other possible way that we could go into this in terms of sort of what's happened with the sort of drop of liberty off the top shelf of desirable things in our society, is safetyism, and we've already touched on this a little bit with John Haidt, and the whole sort of nexus of safetyism and public health, and how that can sort of constitute a road to serfdom. Another phrase which maybe we could make certain people cringe if they're listening. Obviously, it's associated with Hayek, it's associated with libertarian view.
Yeah,
and I even cringe slightly because there was a time when I thought those views were exaggerated. Hayek's idea that even sort of state services, eventually having too much state expenditure, could lead you down the road of serfdom, because it sounded like a partisan debating point to try and knock down state spending, saying, "Oh, it's all going to lead to communism." It seemed, or national socialism, some form of collectivism. It all seemed a bit exaggerated. But the fact is, if you look at the last 2 years, I mean, almost whether you think that these measures were necessary or not, the facts are that we have actually suspended liberties which a few years ago we would have thought of as pretty absolute, or things that should be abrogated only in extreme cases: the right to assembly, and in some cases the freedom of speech to sort of dissent against government,
the right to protest, the right to express political views in many different ways.
So is it crazy?
And the right to bodily sovereignty as well. The right to refuse medical treatment has been compromised in many countries through vaccine mandates. And people can say that no one's forced to have the vaccine, which is strictly speaking true. But when you threaten people's livelihoods if they don't take a certain measure, I don't think you can argue that's not coercion.
Yeah, and so again, I mean, the interesting thing for me is just the really interesting thing for me isn't so much the decisions. I mean, maybe this is going to sound like a cop-out, but it's the way that the freedom argument gets you nowhere. That's a really big change, I think. That at least, and I think this is the proper way that these kind of arguments should proceed. I'm not really an absolutist, even really with free speech and stuff, even though I think that's one of the basic foundations of our society. I'm open to arguments like, in this particular case, there are these huge, overwhelming considerations that mean we have to limit it. Okay, I'm open to that argument, but then the other side has to be open to the idea that well, actually, this freedom of speech thing is really important, or this freedom thing is really important. Freedom of protest is actually really important. And I think even 5 or 10 years ago, or 2 years ago, people at that point would sit back and say, that's true. We need to try and find some space for more freedom in this particular situation.
I think you're right. And I think there are ways to handle these things, as arguably, say, during the Second World War, where certain freedoms were put into abeyance. But there are two things that I think are necessary in the political discourse to make that acceptable. One is more or less what you just said, an explicit acknowledgement that that's what's going on and that it's undesirable. It's an undesirable necessity to do it in the face of a very great threat. And the other is a clear sunset clause. That is, everybody understood during World War II that when the war was over, all of those liberties would be restored. And so if a democratically elected leader is to say, actually, we recognize the very great imposition on liberty that, say, a lockdown to combat COVID entails, we recognize that. However, because of this crisis, we're putting it in place, but we promise you that it will be reviewed by this date, and if the threat is abated, it will certainly be lifted. Whereas that wasn't ever part of the rhetoric about all of these things. They just got put in place. And now, for example, Jacinda Ardern is talking about extending her traffic light system, which is what she calls her different levels of alertness in terms of COVID response, to cover winter seasonal flu this year. Why not just keep it? Hey, and then maybe next year too, we could have, some restrictions, make people wear masks if there's flu. So it is this kind of creeping authoritarianism that I think does actually vindicate Hayek and his road to serfdom. And we could trace it back to some things that started to happen in the 1990s, like banning smoking in private establishments, for example. And yeah, you can defend doing that because people don't want smoke in their faces when they're eating their meals. But of course, Hayek's response to that might be, well, okay, so why not go and find a restaurant where smoking has been banned by the proprietor, because that proprietor wants to attract people who don't like smoking. And so that's the kind of market response to that. If there's a sufficient demand, it will be met.
And that would have been a very elegant market response, because the number of restaurants and cafes which ban smoking would track with some degree of accuracy the number of people who wanted to be in a non-smoking restaurant.
That's right.
So rather than have a very sort of blunt instrument of everyone's banned from smoking indoors, you could easily produce a world in which, people had the choice, and, you'd be equally able to find a non-smoking or smoking restaurant. Now, as views changed on smoking, and they probably would have anyway, you might find that there are fewer and fewer smoking restaurants, but that's just life at the end of the day. And you probably could have continued to find one or two. But it's interesting that kind of argument, at the time, I remember sort of resisting it. And it was already a kind of unpopular view to defend smoking in pubs. But the kinds of arguments were, I think, I wouldn't call sort of fully authoritarian ones, but to someone who was raised to be a sort of mainstream liberal, I thought that they were kind of puzzling, because we were meant to abide by this thing that, people are allowed to do what they want as long as they're not harming others. Mill's golden rule. But of course, it was part of the argument then, to be fair, that passive smoking, that's why we're banning indoors.
Does harm others. But of course, that it's a little bit spurious, because you're not forced to be in the presence of a... So maybe you can sustain the argument for certain public places that it's reasonable to ban smoking in a public place, especially if it's enclosed. For example, in a library or a cinema. No, a cinema isn't public. Sorry, in a library or a public meeting hall or something like that. But a private establishment is a different matter. And just to pick up on that, your point that changing attitudes over time would have led to a lot of maybe a large majority of restaurants banning smoking of their own accord, we might reflect, I might reflect as a vegetarian, that, there are arguments, which I wouldn't push too hard, but there are arguments that, meat eating is bad for the environment because you've got to, feed all those cows and they fart and create greenhouse gases, etc. I'm not a huge proponent of, that's not my reason for being a vegetarian, but there is an emerging market of restaurants that are vegetarian, catering to people who perhaps don't want to be in establishments where meat is served, and just about all restaurants now have some vegetarian options, whereas 40 years ago, if you wanted to eat out and you were a vegetarian, you would meet very slim pickings. So,
right. So the point where it tips over into something that's maybe not full authoritarianism, but which is illiberal, is when people start saying, okay, we're going to not have any meat at all at schools, or
right.
we're going to ban meat from restaurants because it's bad. But
yeah,
but you can see the logic of these things. I mean, I want to steel man it, and I find it easy to steel man it because I can see the logic. I mean, it's quite a compelling logic in a sense. It's a sort of collectivist logic, but I don't use that word to dismiss it. I mean, the idea is simply, we're all on this planet together, we're all in the same boat, we're all in this country together. There's a public health problem, there's a disease, or there's smoking, and what we do affects others. So that's the interesting thing. I mean, I think so. Mill's golden rule was always sort of slightly insecure because it states, you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't deprive others of their liberty or harm them. Sometimes it's called the harm principle, depending on what formulation you take. But of course, it was always true, even when Mill wrote that everything we do affects others. So it's really
and so where you draw the line on harm, it remains an open question.
It's really just a matter of where you draw the line. I think that really what liberal societies are, they're not necessarily societies which are more consistent with the harm principle, although it is often a useful rule of thumb. It's more that they veer on the side of freedom when it comes to these trade-offs, and that's something that we were usually quite good at doing in the English-speaking, in the liberal democratic world. And I've seen that change. And the point where I think of Hayek is actually something which I would have thought was quite an extreme argument to make 10 or 20 years ago, which is about single-payer health systems, which probably shouldn't get into this because both of the countries that I'm a citizen of, in the UK and Canada, they see their public health systems, single-payer public health systems, where the state is sort of monopsonic, it's the only provider, as one of the great achievements of their countries, in quite a strong sense. I mean, they had a poll of the greatest Canadians a few years ago, and the person who won was actually the guy who designed the Medicare system. But so the argument that I used to think was quite extreme was basically one that says, if everyone's feeding into the funding for the healthcare system, it's very easy to come to positions that limit others' freedom, right? So you don't want to pay for people going mountaineering because mountaineering has a certain amount of risk. A certain number of people are going to end up in intensive care, and everyone has to pay for it. So why don't you either ban mountaineering or put a tax on it? And it seemed to me
playing rugby or driving cars, or where are you going to stop?
Well, exactly. It seemed to be an extreme argument in the past because I'd never really seen in principle that kind of thing happen. And then as the noughties drew on, you started to get these taxes on sugary drinks and things like that. And I think that the COVID is similar in some sense because often you get this argument that it's not just about the disease spreading, it's about the burden on the health system, which is seen as a kind of common thing, which it is. And I'm not, again, this is an argument I'm putting out there, not because I necessarily want to do away with single-payer healthcare systems, because they have a lot of benefits as well. I mean, the obvious benefit is that if you're poor, you don't even have to worry about whether you have insurance or not. You just get medical treatment for free, and that's great. But I do think that there is this tendency that Hayek touched on, and I've seen this happen now. I mean, I think I have real experience of how there is a slippery slope.
Yeah, that's right. And here it is actually worth coming back to Erich Fromm again, in his observation of this tension between collectivism and individualism. And of course, that trajectory that we talked about before that he described from early Protestantism and capitalism liberating people from the medieval hierarchy, the medieval social structure that was very rigid, and the subsequent fear that they experienced in the face of economic insecurity and spiritual an existential crisis that eventually, under his thesis, drove the German people to embrace fascism. And he recognized as a general tendency, not just a German phenomenon. His solution to that is not to go back to some kind of medieval womb state where we're again protected by a rigid social hierarchy. In fact, he says that's impossible. You can no more do that than you can go back to the literal womb. You see, being born is itself an incredibly shattering experience psychoanalytically from certain perspectives, right? You go from this environment in which you really don't, well, we can't say that a fetus doesn't suffer, but it's encased in a warm environment where it never has to worry about anything. It's fed through the umbilical cord, etc. And then it's thrust out into this world of perpetual change where suddenly everything is less secure and more frightening. And the developing infant has to learn to deal with that, which is, why things like breastfeeding children and nurturing them closely when they're very young, when they're infants, is so important. You've got to respond to those needs, because otherwise they're left in a state of terror that they can't actually deal with, because they don't yet have the psychological apparatus to project into the future. And so left alone crying in a dark room, a very young infant isn't capable of seeing that will come to an end and that they can learn to deal with it. They don't yet have the ability to do that. And so we have to nurture children gradually to accept responsibility, gradually to see that suffering is an inevitable part of life, and to embrace the freedom that comes with accepting that challenge, as it were. But Fromm's ultimate social perspective is that we can't go back to a sort of fully collective, tribal lifestyle, even if we want to. Instead, this phase of individualism is a necessary one before we go on to, as it were, resolve the dialectic between individualism and collectivism by being mature enough psychologically to be full individuals, and then to embrace our collective responsibility for one another as well, to see that life is better if we exist in voluntary communities where people have a respect for one another, a compassion for one another, and will look after one another when things happen that are unexpected and that put people under intolerable conditions. Sometimes that could be disability, sometimes it could be illness, sometimes it could be economic disaster, whatever. But so the sort of solipsistic individual is not the end point of this trajectory. Rather, it's the individual who freely chooses community, because that's what a free individual will do, because we're human beings and we're social creatures. And so part of expressing our individuality is to embrace responsibility for one another, even though the primary responsibility is for oneself, in as much as we have to accept the consequences of our choices.
That's right. I mean, that's a very Aristotelian thought. What does he say? The human being is a social animal. It's Doon politikon, the kind of animal that characteristically lives in a polis, a city-state, so a community of others. I think that has to be right. I mean, it has to be true both that we have a nature as individuals and a nature as members of a society, or we have a tendency to be and want to contribute to a society. Of course, it doesn't deal with the sort of quandary of liberal philosophy that we've been dealing with, which is precisely sort of where do you draw the line in these cases.
No.
But I mean, not that we're going to solve that today, because it's a big question.
No, we're not going to solve it, but we might reflect that actually democratic institutions are pretty good at locating that line at a point that a society is ready to locate it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
to give that comment some context, I used to probably even 10, 15 years ago, I was much more sympathetic to the idea of libertarian anarchy than I am now as a political thing. So I took a fairly staunch Hayekian line on all sorts of things, and saw the state as an unacceptable encroachment on life in general, and looked forward to its abolition. And gradually realized that actually that isn't an attainable state until people are psychologically mature enough to be able to do the things that the state does for people without the coercion of the state. And so to me now, that kind of freedom is something almost to look forward to in a spiritual sense and to hope for. And I guess it's an article of faith of those of us who want to argue for freedom, that if we set the human spirit free, that then it becomes generous, that it becomes loving.
You sound like a Buddhist. I mean, that's often what I hear when I go to Buddhist.
Yeah, well, whether it's Buddhists or Christian,
yeah.
Maybe Muslim, I don't know enough about it. Maybe all of these religions hold the human spirit in that kind of esteem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the religions that they're best and most sophisticated often are saying two things at once. One is that we have Buddha nature, bodhicitta, or we have, we're all part of Christ Jesus, or we all have, the divine spirit, however we conceive it, in us. But at the same time, we're also suffering beings. We have original sin. We've broken the contract with the Almighty. I think religions are often quite ambiguous and two-sided. But maybe it's not really a genuine ambivalence, because I think that these two things are present in us. We have great capacities, and also great capacities for failure and getting things wrong.
Yeah, well, that's right. And something like the notion of original sin, can be interpreted as a basis for compassion for one another, because we're all the same in that respect. We're all flawed. And it's something that I think is deeply wrong with the current ideological perspective of cancel culture, which doesn't have that redemptive quality, that it excommunicates people once and for all, and takes a self-righteous position that leads to these purity spirals where people get more and more obsessed with being completely right and completely correct in all their views, which is a dreadful psychological prison, and excommunicates more and more people who don't adhere to those rigid positions. It seems to me unsustainable for that reason.
Yeah, I think this is another thing that makes it very difficult at the moment to take a very strong line against Putin or dictatorships like Russia is at the moment. Because I think 20 years ago, we were sort of more secure in our moral high ground, because we could say very certainly, that doesn't happen here. Writers don't get in trouble just for saying things that go against the elite view, and now they do. So that makes it very difficult to sort of stand up and say, you're obviously worse than us. I mean, I think Putin very much is worse than us still, even with cancel culture.
Yeah.
But I've noticed, there are certain figures on the American right who are basically going the full way with that argument and saying, he's no worse than us. I think he is still worse than us, but there are various ways in which what's happened over the past 3 or 4 years with the various moral panics has sort of robbed us of this of this platform that we were standing on, which was allowing us to make arguments from from a position which was in some ways a little bit hypocritical, because we were never perfect, but it was actually a fairly respectable and respected position at the time, that the West could say we have genuinely free societies, and societies which are sort of explicitly organized around freedom as well as equality and a few other things.
I mean, I do think the greatest flaw in that argument has always been foreign policy. The extent to which we haven't always been as careful with the liberties of people in other countries as we are with those in our own. So I think that is a fair criticism, whether it was, Reagan's excursions into Central America, whether it was the ill-fated adventure in Vietnam, or, arguably even the bombing of the Balkans during the 1990s. The impact on people in those countries hasn't necessarily been sufficiently taken into account. The Iraq War as well. and Libya. I mean, I think that's an immense travesty that under the Obama administration, and I think fairly much orchestrated by Hillary Clinton, they destroyed a state. To be sure, they took out a dictator who wasn't very nice. Muammar Gaddafi was not a nice character. However, what they left behind is demonstrably much worse. It's a failed state where people starve and where warlords battle it out. So they took no responsibility for the mess that they made there. Now, that doesn't leave us as bad as Putin in terms of being an authoritarian or being callous towards people's plight, but I do think it's something that we need to own up to without resiling from values of liberty and democracy, but rather recognizing our own failures to uphold them at all times, especially for other countries.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because I know we have a slight disagreement around intervention. I mean, for the record, I'm not a hugely aggressive interventionist, but I do think it's an option, when it passes the sort of test of classical just war theory. One of whose prescriptions is that you should have a good probability of winning. So, I think that in certain circumstances, like Sierra Leone, it made sense to go in. I'm not going to argue for a kind of all-out attack on China tomorrow. I think that would be absolute madness.
No, and I'm not a complete anti-interventionist either. I just think that, I mean, what's been lacking in a lot of these situations from Vietnam on, the Middle East, Central America, is a kind of clear conception of what success would look like. Because it's one thing to roll a dictator. A superpower like the United States and its allies, they're very good at doing that. They've got the hardware and the military force to do that quite easily. But what then? And that's the problem. There's no military solution to the problem of values. So if you invade a country with no history of democracy, that doesn't have the value base to support a democracy, and take out a dictator, you leave a vacuum that will be filled by something else that is authoritarian. You can have a free election. They had a free election in the Palestinian territories that ended up with the Islamic Brotherhood being elected.
That doesn't bother me. I mean, that just sounds like somebody saying they had a referendum and Brexit won. Therefore,
well, that's fair enough, but you can't argue that that's going to be a liberal democracy. That's my point.
No, okay, then we have to get into the discussion of is democracy good in itself, even separate from liberalism? Can you have illiberal democracies, and if so, are they?
Well, you can have illiberal elections. You can have elections with illiberal outcomes. Put it that way.
That's right. Yeah, I agree. But it's good that you raised this, because maybe this should be one of the last things we talk about, because I think we're almost coming up to an hour.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm really interested in the way the argument about intervention has gone, because I remember at the time of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan after September the 11th, people on the interventionist side would say, oh, democracy is an absolute good, liberty is an absolute good. And I was sympathetic to those arguments. Therefore, we should go in. And certain people, I mean, some of them actually on the right at the time would say, no, you can't do that. It's not just a matter of state building, as in Francis Fukuyama's book on the subject. All the policy wonk for talking about how to build up a state. And other intellectuals were saying, no, it's not so simple. They were making the argument you just made that, you have to build things up slowly. And at the time, the response to that was, well, that's kind of a racist argument. It's interesting because even then, that phrase, that word was kind of winning arguments on its own, right? Because it looked at that point like saying some societies aren't just up for democracy. It was really reactionary. And I mean, I know you can go back to kind of Carlyle and James Mill, I mean, people in the 19th century, imperialists who had that argument. People in the British Empire said, certain parts of the world just aren't suited to democracy. And then they really actually did have some pretty terrible
actual racism behind their
racist theories about,
but of course, even a superficial survey of history tells us that argument is neither odd nor racist, because the West itself had no liberal instincts until 400 years ago at best.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they weren't really democracies with very significant portions of the electorate voting.
Well,
until the
no,
late
I mean,
19th
New
century.
Zealand in 1900, there was only one full democracy in the world, and it was New Zealand, because at
Yeah,
that time, that
depends
was
on
the
how you
only
measure
country
it.
that gave
Yeah.
universal suffrage to all adults.
Yeah, if you measure it like that, that's correct. Yeah. So, but it's very interesting to me that this argument that, I mean, it seems like the position of the sort of status quo right now, which is basically kind of left-wing position, which is heavily influenced by woke, is that, intervention is obviously just a bad thing, and that makes it very difficult to argue, even in the case of Ukraine, which wouldn't really be an intervention, in my opinion. It would be kind of defense of Ukraine against the aggressor.
Sure.
It's very hard to make any argument against that.
I don't think there's any moral argument against it. I think, morally, if NATO determined that it was able to successfully defend Ukraine without egregious risk of nuclear war, then they probably should do it.
Yeah. I suppose I was just harking back to the earlier argument there that it would just be hard to talk about because of democracy and freedom. But it does strike me as interesting, at any rate, that I think this argument, the status quo position now, I think, would be against George W. Bush style intervention. I mean, that I think also explains why the retreat from Afghanistan was so precipitous, right? That we just pulled out like that, and there was very little purchase for arguments from people saying, actually, we have a role to defend liberal institutions in Afghanistan, because that kind of thing just seems a bit silly now. But the reason it seems silly is because I think this argument is one that it's a kind of a strange position for the woke left to be in favor of now, which is that different societies are suited to a different extent to democracy and liberalism, right? Because if you didn't believe that, then why not go into Afghanistan and make it a liberal democracy?
Well, their position may be more cynical than that. Perhaps they believe that democracy and liberalism is really just a thin facade over patriarchy and heteronormativity and all of those words, racism.
Yeah, which is also strange because, I mean, okay, this is complicated, and I don't even want to say the woke left is in on this, because of course there is a very strong.
We don't want to straw man them, no.
No, but I mean, even if you take to my mind, pretty crazy view that our societies are irredeemably racist and sexist and all that, most sane people can still see that there's a huge contrast with the Taliban.
Yeah.
So anyway, we probably got ourselves into enough trouble for one night.
Excellent. Yeah.
And so I guess I just wanted to say again, we're going to be doing this live stream where we read Jeremy Waldron's book, The Harm and Hate Speech. I mean, there are going to be four of us, Michael and I, and two friends. And we'll put out the date on our Twitter, I guess.
And our vast social network presence will advertise it to all and sundry, and we'll have 1 million listeners, I'm sure.
Social network. And I just want to do something which I'm gonna like turn on the YouTube stream again just to see what it looks like. There might be some echo, but yeah. All right, cool. There we are, and it's excellent. We got one person watching, which is me. So I think we literally had 0 people, but it has worked, so that's good. And I can even type. This would be interesting. I'll type something in. Type something into the little comment bar. All right. Should we end this?
Yeah.